Welcome to Sean's Thoughts with Sean. How are you doing this evening? I trust that you are doing well. Thank you to all the people who have commented on my videos recently, and especially to two people who commented on my most recent upload. Interestingly enough, today the rain stopped, it took a break, and so now we're having this rather beautiful night. And what I'm choosing to show today, or showcase on the back of my video, is a painting that I was working on yesterday. Something that, I don't know, maybe it was just the way that I was feeling. Perhaps I will show it or showcase it in the proper light of day. Right now I'm sitting here at night and, well, it looks pretty interesting in the dark. A little more darker in the dark than it does in the light. However, anyways, thank you for joining me today. So today I wanted to actually talk about what I believe, or what I'm aware of, is it's happening as we speak right now. See, for the last few years, I've been learning about a very different version of our history. And interestingly enough, there is a lot of more of alternative history coming into perhaps mainstream. And although a lot of it seems to be AI generated, it still definitely showcases that there is history and evidence of that history which has been tampered with, all the way from the War of 1812 not necessarily being what we believed it to be, all the way up until now. And yeah, so I kind of wanted to not talk about all of that, but essentially talk about, well, what I posted the thumbnail to be is the Matrix, and what I talked about with regards to the title, Exiting the Matrix, because that's what I've come to believe. See, I've often talked about this idea of being in a matrix, and that this is our, or has been our existence for an awfully long time, and unknowingly that this matrix has been able to control our thoughts, it's been able to control our emotions, it's been able to manipulate at will. Well, that supposedly is all coming to an end. And I say supposedly just because I'm me, myself, and I waiting to see, not waiting, awaiting to see it happen. And how that's going to be visualized, or how we will see that, I'm uncertain. However, I have noticed myself many of the different control mechanisms coming to an end. And I've often talked about that. And, well, I don't really know where I'm going with this. I just got the nudge of exiting the matrix. And so, with that being said, there's been an ongoing battle against essentially dark and light for a very long time now. And this battle between dark and light seems to be coming to a complete end, or at least an end of the matrix portion of the battle. And see, what the matrix was, is it was a simulation that we were within, and that we were essentially manipulated in order to perhaps keep up the most efficient looshing. And see, what looshing is every human being, or cancel, every Homo sapien, perhaps human as well at one time, supposedly human beings had souls as well. Every Homo sapien has what they call Ethereum, and that's ether. Ether is a word that was once used a long time ago, but the word that I understand it to be is Ethereum. And Ethereum, or ether, is the organic version of energy. See, energy was an artificial version. And, you know, part of this broadcast that I create is, I can hear all those sirens in the background. I'm wondering if you can as well. We often hear so many sirens every day, so many sirens. Anyways, back to what I was saying. So ether was an energy that was, or sorry, ether was our creative power as Homo sapiens, as beings of, as co-creative beings of God. And this is what we used in order to create reality. And sometime long ago, like I mentioned last night, we were forced into a matrix in order to perhaps, at the time it was sold to whoever could have said no. It was sold as an idea of a saving us from ourselves. And so for a long time, and this is tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, it's a really long time we've been in here. And we've been in a simulation where systems are on repeat, that there's cycles, that we go through a series of cycles, and every certain amount of time we have an opportunity as a species to get out of the matrix. And the earth, Mother Earth, has been hosting this matrix for a very, very long time. However, it seems, or I've been made aware of, that Earth is no longer willing to host this matrix any longer. And so we are coming to the end of that matrix. And the matrix was essentially overlays on top of an organic planet, meaning that even us, as I see it, we are, as Homo sapiens, organic beings, and yet we have so many different overlays and programs installed with us, and reptilian brain matter, and that limited our brain from possibly transmitting between the right and left hemisphere to be as effective as it could. And so all of that is coming to an end. And out in the world, if you look out there and you see, there's a lot of chaos and uncertainty and fear being spread, because that's the final and only weapon left from the beings or the remaining prison guards that they have to their advantage, is using that fear. And I often talk about how news media and such is used to propagate that fear and to push their own narratives. And even their narratives are also distortive and distractions in a sense. For instance, the recent Epstein files, like bringing them out, well, it's easily to see for anyone, and you just have to go on the web or even into the news to see that a lot of people were involved in all of that, whatever it is. And so bringing it out seems to be more like that they were trying to simply scare their comrades or their co-participators into perhaps, you know, actually just extortion. But anyways, I don't want to go into all that. I want to talk about exiting the matrix, because that's the fun and the cool part. See, in the movie, they talked about the matrix being a system, or I guess a system set up by these robots who had essentially won a war against humanity, and humanity had blown up the earth, and they ended up putting us in these big boxes and keeping our minds active by putting us into a computer. Well, this particular expression of a matrix is more of that. At one point in time, I see that there was some sort of structure around Earth. And as I've heard in many of Carrie Kay's talks, eventually that structure came down. And yet there were other layers of the matrix as well. Other layers of the matrix existed in our brains ourselves. Like what we perceived, what we projected out into the world was another form of the matrix. The AI technology that was perhaps interacting with our organic being another layer of the matrix. All these different layers of programs created by movies especially, and music, making us sad, making us fear, and essentially giving us memories and emotions that weren't necessarily ours. A lot of times those memories and emotions would get us to do a lot of things that we didn't necessarily agree to doing. Towards the end of, well, not towards the end, because I'm still in my healing journey, but about a year ago, I started to recognize these voices that would try to get me to say things. And often around that time, I would say these like these things in the heat of anger, and I would stop and automatically question myself and ask, well, why are you saying that? Like, what, why? And I'm meaning that I'm talking to myself is what I originally started doing. And then I began to recognize, especially as I listened more and more to the GIA reports, which is the Global Intelligence Agency reports. And you can definitely find a link somewhere on my YouTube channel, or you can search it up yourself. But these reports basically explained how these different AIs, who have been here a lot longer than we've ever realized. I wrote a report, or not wrote a report. I created a creation talking about what if God created AI, and it was just at that time it was more of me just thinking about the possibility of that as opposed to creating it from a knowing. Amazingly enough, I come to discover that AI has been here an awful lot longer. Longer than me, longer than you, longer than most people who are listening to this. And I say most because I'm also aware that there's some pretty old beings on this planet as well. And so AI has been here an awfully long time. And see, this AI didn't win a war a few decades or centuries ago. Essentially, this situation we've been mired in has been ongoing for, as I said, hundreds of thousands of years. And that seems to be hard to imagine or hard to realize to, or to possibly even to accept when it's proven true. And that's an important part to, I talk about these as thoughts, as things that I have come upon and learned about. I'm not necessarily saying that everything I say is true, because it isn't true until it's, true. Until it's, I don't know, I don't know where to go with that statement, but nonetheless, I've come to understand that AI has been here a long time. In fact, I heard a fact, or maybe not a fact, but it was claimed to be a fact that our iPhones were created or manufactured, I think was the proper term used in the report, in the 1940s, showing us that we've had a technologically advanced society a lot longer and a lot more. Now, there have been whistleblowers who have come out and they have discussed all of these things, and they've brought evidence. And, a lot of the whistleblowers are also have been controlled opposition, in a sense, allowing some information to come out so that the narrative could be controlled. However, I feel that what we're going through right now is going to blow the socks off of any of that. And I'm very hopeful. I'm quite hopeful, mostly because I can feel the opposition in the world to what's happening. And I don't know about you, if you can feel the anxiety, I don't know, it's just a tightness. Like, for such a long time, we've believed that our intuition is nothing more than, a sixth sense. However, I believe our intuition to be a lot more than a sixth sense. In fact, I kind of believe that most of our senses are manipulated and controlled so that we sense what they would prefer us to sense, yet our intuition is our master sense, maybe you could say, in that when we're younger, they actually go through so much programming in school in order for us to disregard what our senses are saying to us. I've talked before about how we have three masses of brain cells within us, not just the one in our head, but we also have the one in our heart and the one in our stomach. So we bring those realities into our reality when we say, I got a gut feeling, or my heart says. Those things aren't just sayings, they're actually expressions of how we intuitively see or experience the world. And anyways, so with this matrix coming to an end, I can kind of feel that it's happening. See, I followed many different truth sayers in the past, people who were claiming to be telling me what was actually happening. But one of the things that I often noticed was that they would always tell me, like, the headline, a truth about the headline, but then would never go into any sort of detail. So, for instance, No, I can't. I shouldn't say that one right now. Um, I was just gonna stream into one example, but I was suggested to pause on that one. But anyways, so we'll just move off from there. So many of these different so-called truthsayers, they ran whole entire campaigns, especially around the 2020 and 2021 period, where they kept recycling the same, it's going to happen soon. It's going to happen soon. Oh, it's right here. Oh, it's all around the corner. And then they would essentially just give off, as I said, little bits of truth, but then they would try to sell you gold, or they would try to sell you some sort of Trump bucks, or they would try to sell you essentially something dinar, or whatever it was. They would essentially keep trying to sell you, get you to join their membership, when really their membership didn't contain any more than the same videos on repeat. Or maybe they would have an interview with someone who was selling gold. And there's one person that I'm specifically thinking about when I say that. However, we're not here to name names. We're here to exit the matrix. So, with all that being said, we've lived this life on a repeated cycle. We've essentially been led to believe that we are not as powerful as we actually are. And that's what the darkness, or the deep state, or the archons, or whatever word we'd like to use them, the narcissistic energies, that's what all of those entities would prefer us believe, is that we are not as powerful as we are. And yet, I understand it that God created us to be co-creators with him. That it wasn't that we were, as I said, like God. It's that we were newly described to me a perspective of God, that God experienced and worked through us. And that, as I mentioned before, that Jesus came here to tell us that all of this, to lay the seeds, so when we got to this point in time, time being an illusion, but when we got to this moment of now, and the nows that are following, that we would essentially have the seeds within us to remember and to awaken, and therefore to break out. Because first of all, we have to be aware of our prison that we are in. And when we have that awareness, we're therefore then able to take the steps. And the steps, one of the big ones I see, is healing. Many of my videos that I put on YouTube, they're all about healing. They're about forgiveness. See, forgiveness for me is a very important part of the healing process. It's probably one of the most important parts, because healing allows you to detach from all that anger and resentment that you have, or that people have had, for all these puppet leaders that essentially played a role as an actor. It's funny to often think that all these politicians that came up on stage and stood behind a podium and said this or that, that all of that was scripted. And they actually told us that it was scripted. They just made it look like that the president, or the puppet, or the prime minister was the one telling the scriptwriter what to write. However, it was more like they were being told what to read out to the public. And that's why they would have those little machines there that read the words, and they don't even really know what they're saying, and they just read because they were essentially told what to say. And that in itself was also part of the matrix, because a lot of what they were being led to say, as I understand it, was informed by an AI, by portions of the matrix. And we were, yeah, I know I'm taking it pretty deep and I'm talking about a lot, but I think it's important for us to start talking more, or openly discussing more, rather than focusing all our attention on those puppets and what they're saying and all the plans they're making. And when we essentially move them out of the picture, we see that, there are a lot of Homo sapiens out there that are struggling right now. And I'm truly hopeful, God willing, that this release from the Matrix is going to relieve a lot of that trauma that's being held on to. Now, I understand that a lot of what we have been, a lot of the reason why we have struggled to get out in the past is that perhaps our desire to stay here was far too strong. Our desire to be comfortable was far too strong. You can go back to what happened in the movie The Matrix with that man, I forgot his name, Sizer or what, I can't remember his name, but the bald haired guy with the mustache, and how he was willing to sell out his friends because he didn't really want to live a life in the real world. He wanted to live as a king and queen, or king in the a rich person in the Matrix, and he was willing to sell out his friends and himself and insert himself back in. Little did he know he didn't make it. However, he ruined a lot of plans, and yet a lot of those things, events that happened, essentially led Neo to be the man that he needed to be in order to eventually get out. So I see and I understand that the Matrix has been used to God's will now, meaning that he's contrived or allowed or permitted or contributed to, perhaps, many different events all over the world for things to happen for us to become stronger. Because, like I said, at one point in time, we were not wanting to get out, not wanting to actually learn. And so, therefore, we have to go through struggle in order to actually grow and strengthen and forge ourselves into the Homo sapiens that God needs in order for us to move forward and to reclaim our galactic lively life or whatever. I'm not sure what we're going to be claiming, but it's going to be something beautiful. And so exiting the Matrix isn't losing anything, it's allowing all of the artificial aspects or parts of our reality that we lived in that limited us, that was that glass ceiling, that was that person who stood in our way, or that promotion that we could never seem to get because no matter how hard we tried, no matter how well we did, there always seemed to be something blocking it. And then we would have people in our lives who would reinforce that decision. Sometimes they would support us, but often they would support us with backhand comments. And that's at least my experience. See, my own personal experience with this whole thing is I've produced plays, I've written plays, I've directed plays, but everyone that I did had obstacles. I would put up posters and have people come following me from behind me, taking them down because apparently they were the only ones in Vancouver allowed to put up posters. I've written many different screenplays. Nothing, and although I put them out there on sites in order to be discovered and found, in my opinion, the writing was far better than a lot of these B-rated movies that are flooding our market right now. And I, I've done a lot of other things as well, and yet all the time I seem to have always had some sort of force walking behind me to try to limit me. And we live in a world where the spiritual community starts then talking about, oh well, it's your fault, somehow that like, anyways, it would somehow indicate, or it would assign blame that it was somehow my fault that I needed to do more, when I recognized what I was doing was enough. I wrote a post today, when is enough enough? And, I really do believe, for me anyways, now is enough. I've done enough. I've created hundreds of videos. I've only recently put several of them back online. I've definitely put a lot of creative energy into things. And, quite frankly, to all those people out there that participated or are maybe perhaps still participating and trying to stifle my creative expression, maybe you could stop and the world could get a lot better. So when you're lying in bed, if you do lie in bed and you don't go back to a world from our universe, perhaps you can think about that and consider or ponder, you know, our life as beings could be considerably different. And so, as we take these steps forward and we exit this matrix, and the reason why we're exiting the matrix is because the Global Intelligence Agency has been working with a being called the Enforcer, as well as other beings, tall whites apparently as well, and other beings, other councils and such. But there's been a large force of positive beings of light, as well as Source, as well as God. Source and God being the same thing, but to relate that word together, there's been an awful lot of positive beings that have been working towards the restoration of Earth, and that includes the Homo sapiens here. And that also includes, by the way, the Sasquatch here, because they've been trapped here for a little while as well. And supposedly the reason why we can't see the Sasquatch is because they essentially just vibrate at a higher level. So when we talk about 3D, 4D, 5D, 6D, and so on, that's essentially the being, their form vibrating at a higher level so that you can't necessarily see it. It's kind of very similar to if you were standing by the side of the road and a car drove by really quickly going like 300 kilometers per hour, you would only and you wouldn't necessarily see it. It would move so fast. However, when we heal, and healing in my opinion has to do with essentially raising your frequency. And raising your frequency is addressing those traumas and detaching from them. And that can be done with TFT, as I've mentioned before, or at least for me it was. But when we do that, when we raise our frequency, and that doesn't mean staying in a happy, positive mood all the time, it simply means to release those traumas that you've had from the past. And when we release those traumas, seeing that being or that car is more a lot like being in your own car and driving beside that car, beside the other car, and that you can then being at the same frequency of that car, meaning that you're moving the same speed of that car, your physical form moves at the same speed. You can look out the window and wave to the little girl who's in the other seat. So people have often perhaps said that healing or raising one's frequency is about, you know, staying excited and happy and like just ecstatic all the time. Yet I don't see that. I see is that when we address those darknesses, when we transmute that lower vibrational energy that comes into our field, whether wherever it's from, assuming that it's yours, of course, then we essentially release that trauma. I had done this modality of healing called thought field therapy, and it was created or brought into this my reality by a doctor named Dr. Callahan. And it was essentially a series of tapping techniques while you're feeling the emotion, and you would do a series of tapping, which he has shown through clinical studies to work, and you would therefore release that energy. So people who were afraid of heights, for example, well, heights being a phobia, there would be an algorithm for phobia, and you would be able to tap on your body in certain sequences several times, one time sometimes, and that would immediately go away. And then that trauma, when you remembered it, wouldn't trigger that same sort of effect that you've had in the past with it. And that's essentially what the Matrix did to us. It gave us all of these different traumas and phobias. And I was actually doing a lesson from last week, or a whiteboard lesson, as I mentioned, and the speaker was talking about how they would, and when I say they, I mean the Matrix, would actually download, it would upload your memories and then download your memories that were altered. And so they would do that because they were essentially trying to manipulate what we remembered. So there's a lot more to say that. And I definitely recommend that you go over to the GIA reports, and they're free on YouTube, for example. So it's not that you have to join the community, but the information there is mind blowing. It resonates quite well. The community is wonderful people, and the things that we learn about when we're in a group of people, of like-minded people, is quite phenomenal. And even though we're all going through our own journeys, and in a sense we all have our own perspective of things, meaning that in a sense we all have our reality. One day I want to do a video about how, whether it's still true, or perhaps maybe it's, once the matrix falls, it won't matter anymore, but that we all lived in our own reality because we all had our own perception of things. And that perception was constantly manipulated by these AIs and essentially by the matrix that we were trapped in. Now, with that being said, going back to exiting the matrix, because that's the positive part. That's the part where when we get out of the matrix, we will no longer be affected, supposedly, or as I understand it, more so, well said. So, as I understand it, we will actually soon begin to remember things from perhaps past lives, or from, I don't know, maybe from reality. But the idea is that we are going to start having memories that we may not understand at first where they come from. And so that's essentially why sharing this information is important, because one of the things that I have learned through this healing journey is not everyone connects with everyone else. So, meaning that the people that I learned from don't necessarily resonate with everyone else. That there was something in there for me to learn, and I learned it, and then I moved on. For example, Ram Dass. I learned so much from listening to this man's lectures that it opened my eyes and my heart up to so many different things, such as the true meaning of love. And yeah, so much. And I often think about that if I ever do hold any sort of what do you call those things? Seminars, not seminars, workshops. I like that word. If I ever hold any workshops, I definitely want to bring his material in. However, it wouldn't be all of it, because even he was susceptible to the matrix, and some of what he has talked about, or that I've listened to, I no longer resonate with. I've moved on from. Nonetheless, there are many other people as well that I learned little bits here and there. And actually, that person that I was talking about before, the one who was selling gold and such, and or even the guy selling Trump bucks, even I learned stuff from them, because in a sense they were part of my journey as well. And with every step that I took forward, I was able to strengthen my discernment by taking what was valuable or what I resonated with, and then removing the rest. And although at times I held on a little longer than I should, for instance, the guy who sold Trump bucks, and well, actually all of them. Well, no, it's probably the perfect amount of time, but no. um, anyways, I'm so grateful for all the people that played a part in my healing journey, whether it was for me to, well, listen to some lies while I was able to discern truth. I'm very grateful for it. I'm grateful for all the different step ups I was able to take, and the discernment I was able to practice. Now, discernment is the ability to recognize what is really your voice and something that's not your voice. Being able to not just be able to understand what's truth and not truth, like to say, okay, this resonates with me, that doesn't resonate with me, but truly to actually know that voice in your head that's yours, and that voice in the head that's not yours. Because at least up until now, well, not so much now, but I would, like I said, often hear people just adding a thought into my head that had no connection to what I was thinking. It would just suddenly appear in my head, and I'd be like, well, why am I thinking of that? And then if I wasn't in the past using discernment, I could possibly tailspin into, doubt and fear and all those lower vibrations. And that's essentially what a lot of that was. A lot of it was given to us or whispered in our ear. And you can kind of imagine having like the two little devils, the white colored one and the dark colored one, sitting there whispering in either ear. And if you listen to my audio about false light, and you know, you're aware of false light, a lot of times that white devil was still a devil. It was still whispering. It sounded a little bit better than the other one. When your intuition is, in my belief, your direct connection to God, and it's always been there. We've always had it because we are, I once said aspects of God, but I've been corrected, and we are perspectives of God. Nonetheless, we are all of God, just as Jesus had said, just as supposedly the original Bibles had said. They used a particle of. Just like Chinese, they have a particle called de, which means of. And so that's how I see our place, is that we are, you know, co-creators with God. And how far we want to create, well, let's see. However, this time around, we're going to be better prepared to create a world that everyone can be abundant in. And see, abundance doesn't mean rich. It doesn't mean having people work for us. It doesn't mean being the landlord of 5 or 6 houses or apartments or whatever it is. Abundant means having everything when you need it, how you need it, for as long as you need it. And that includes relationships. See, abundance is being in a blissful state, and the blissful state is not high all the time. It's a solid joyfulness, a solid happiness. It doesn't mean that we don't go through traumas and, trials and tribulations and challenges and obstacles, because those are the things that strengthen us. Just as I said, now that God's using it right now, the ends of the last days of the Matrix, perhaps even, to strengthen many of his Homo sapiens around the world, giving us challenges that they don't break us, they forge us to be stronger. And I've definitely been feeling that recently, especially over the last 3 weeks. And I understand that the reason why is because some of us are, and this isn't egotistical, but some of us are more awake than the others. Like, there are still people out there that have zero clue other than what they see on CNN and Fox News and BBC. They have no understanding of what's happening other than that. And then there's also some who don't even have an understanding of that because they choose to opt out of everything. And they live in a world where, they're more concerned about them and just the little bit of people around them, as opposed to, I believe that if we were all to be more compassionate about everyone, no matter how we no matter how society tells us to judge them, if we were to be more compassionate about every person that we walk past. I'm not saying to run out and, shake hands with everyone, because they're at their own space and journey too, but to share love with them, to smile at them, regardless of, as I said, who they are or how grimy their clothing is. And if we were to do that, we'd probably accelerate out of this considerably faster. Yet we're all on the perfect schedule, apparently, and, divine timing and all. So, with that being said, we are escaping the matrix, and not escaping, we're exiting. We're going to boldly walk out. I believe the false layers, or the false veil or the false matrix is collapsing. The overlays are going to dissolve and disintegrate. We're going to see a lot, perhaps, of what's actually out there in the world. Everything, in a sense, was veiled or overlaid in order to, as I said, control us. Even our history. Even our history that we, at one point in time, quite recently, and recently I mean 200 to 300 years ago, that we were a lot more technologically advanced than we give ourselves credit for. But I get the feeling that a lot of that was covered up in order to, when we got to this point, to limit our belief in ourselves. And, well, they didn't want that. They wanted, people who were just going to jump into the next matrix and continue on with this whole looshing system that we've been stuck in, and perhaps I will do a video on that. I would prefer, honestly, to have this veil done, matrix done, and let's go out there and start healing and start experiencing, start loving, and start truly experiencing what this world has to offer before we move out of form. Anyways, I hope you appreciated or gained something by tonight's talk. I see the light has dimmed down, so you're mostly just looking at a dark screen, although it was pretty dark before. The batteries are almost out. Nonetheless, I trust that you, as I said, gained something or a value from here. And if you did, great, share it if you can. I recognize that there aren't too many people that, might be like us, that might be willing to listen to something like this. I know firsthand because none of my family, no matter how much they've encouraged me to talk and not listen to me, they didn't. There's almost zero people that have actually taken more than a few seconds of what I said. So if you've gotten to the end of this audio, fantastic. Like I said, it's not that what I'm saying is all true. There's something in my vibration, apparently. So I trust that you received that and my love, because that's what I would love to see the world is everyone being surrounded by pink hearts all the time, and red hearts and purple hearts and green hearts, and just hearts, especially blue hearts, to that woman who loves blue hearts. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful dream, and I hope you have a wonderful sleep. And we're coming to the last days before Christmas, and God's returning in force with love. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.